Welcome to Exchanging Notes, the interviews. I'm John. Today I have the privilege of conversing with Ayelet Tsabari with the 2013 publication of her debut short story collection, The Best Place on Earth. Ayelet received the Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature and was a New York Times editor's book review. I think I got that in the wrong order. New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice.
That's right.
Yes,
That's right.
She was one of those too. Now, the stories of Ayelet Tsabari give us an inside view of a situation where personal and political identity meet, clash, and then often go someplace else and do it again. We are going to be talking about the past, the present, the future, and we shall start right now with putting a date on you, if I may do that. You were born
73.
in 1973 in Tel Aviv,
Yeah.
which was the year of the Yom Kippur
That's
War.
right. Yeah.
Was it an overshadowed year? Was that a happy year?
No, it was a terrible year. Of course, I wouldn't know, but I do know that at 5 months I was at the shelter. I've been told that, I was 5 months old when the war started. So I have this image in my head. It's funny, once you start writing something, even if someone else told you that story, it almost becomes a memory. So obviously I can't remember that, but I have that image in my head of, my father ushering all 5 children at the time. 4 children, my mom carrying me down to the shelter. So, yeah.
When you think about Tel Aviv in your childhood, what is the one memory that comes to your mind that says, this is Tel Aviv for me, this is why I love Tel Aviv?
Oh, the sea, there's no doubt.
The sea, in what way?
Well, Israel is an interesting country because in many ways, but one of the ways it's that it's on the shore. The whole thing is on the coast, and it's a very narrow country. So it's like 2 hours from east to west.
Yeah.
And then there's this beautiful shoreline of beaches. So it's everywhere. It's there all the time. You can't miss it. You smell it kind of all the time. And it's also, ironically, the only border that is sort of steady and doesn't change.
Yeah. And I guess you go to the sea to get away from it all. Sea has connotations of vacation and sunbathing and stuff like that.
Yeah, and when you feel like, especially growing up, the peace with Egypt was 1980, I believe.
Yes.
So, but it wasn't immediately like you could just, feel comfortable going. The peace with Jordan wasn't until 94 or 91.
Still not picked up at the book sale. Number 212. With the person who has the card for the book that they've checked at the book sale, please come and get it immediately. Number 212. Thank you.
All yours.
So it felt like an island in a weird way, right? Because you couldn't. There was no. I've always used to envy how I watched American movies and watched them just like drive, and I'm like,
you can't do that.
You can't do that really. So the beach provided, the sea provided this kind of a promise of sorts, like an escape, like the unknown, beyond. There was.
Could I ask you about your parents? Could we start with your mother? Could you tell me a bit about your mother? Did she have an occupation?
She didn't work. Mm-hmm. She only raised 6 children. She was a homemaker. She had raised 6 children, swimmingly, if I may say so myself. Mm-hmm.
And your father was a lawyer.
My father was a lawyer.
What sort of law did he practice?
I'm not really actually sure. You know what I mean? Like, he died when I was young. I think it was mostly just contracts and things like that. He died just a month before my 10th birthday. Mm-hmm. So when I was little, I said my father works at an office. You
wrote the most interesting poem about your father, who I believe was deceased at the age of 44.
Yep.
It's such a strange thing, because I've had that situation myself, where you're the same age you were when your parent died.
Yeah.
And you suddenly say to yourself, wow, mortality, did that hit you?
Yeah, it was a very strange. It is still that year, but it was mostly the birthday when I reached 44. It was a very strange moment, and it also felt like a leaving him in a sense, another goodbye in a sense, like walking away from him as I'm advancing to a place to an age where he wasn't ever.
So you were going into areas that he didn't know.
Yeah.
You were maturing beyond him, and in a
it's
way,
bizarre.
there's that reversal of roles. You become the elder, which is a very disconcerting thing.
Yeah.
How about your siblings? You have 5 siblings.
I have 5.
Your mother was busy.
I know.
How many boys
Poor
and how
thing.
many girls?
So there's 4 boys and 2 girls.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it explains a lot.
4 boys?
Yeah.
Tell me about them.
So we've always been really close, really tight. They're all artistic in their own ways, but only me and my brother actually went in the direction. My brother teaches music in Concordia. He's the only one who lives in Canada as well. He's a professor of some alternative, esoteric, electroacoustic music thing. And the rest of them, chose more reasonable, I guess, occupations. But we've grew up with a lot of art and a lot of music and a lot of
Your father was invited to take part in a poetry at university or something.
No, so before my father died, he always wanted to be a poet, and he wrote a lot when he was young, but he got some really negative critique from a teacher. And also, he's never really had a role model because in Israel, there were no Yemeni. My family came from Yemen to Israel in the 1930s. I should probably explain that.
Yes.
My parents were born in Israel, but my family is from Yemen. So Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent in Israel are called Mizrahi, as opposed to Ashkenazi, who are Jews who came from European countries mostly. So he didn't really have any role model in our community. And he actually even mentioned it in a poem he wrote. He said something like, I'm translating and trying to remember at the same time, but he said something about how poetry is an artist kingdom, not for you, son of Yemen. So he actually thought it wasn't something he could do.
That's a very striking sort of admission, and one wonders if it's an admission of defeat or an admission, or if it's acceptance or something that you yourself perhaps are working beyond now that you've reached beyond.
It was a little bit of a legacy, like like not to change that, to make a difference in that sense, because even I grew up without seeing myself reflected in literature. So it was better than it was in his time, but it was still lacking, I still didn't know of a Yemeni author, say, growing up, So it was, writing this book, the characters are predominantly Mizrahi, as you've noticed. It was something I did, it was a mission. I was like, I'm going to write the characters that were missing from my childhood stories, I'm going to create characters like me, like my mom, like my dad, like my grandmother.
Tell me about yourself as a child. Were you social? Were you a loner? Were you a reader? Were you outdoorsy?
I was an avid reader.
Of whom?
So I read everything. Seriously, we had so many books in the house, and I just read everything. I was very non-discriminating. I was like, now I'm going to take this book. Now I'm going to take this book. So I read really everything. So there were like European translated literature, like I don't know if people in Canada even read, because I didn't grow up here, but things like Enid Blyton, whom I love, which is a British writer, and Jules Verne.
Jules Verne.
Yeah, and so Little Women. So a lot of that too, but then a lot of Israeli authors as well.
The books that struck you, the books that have stayed with you and perhaps influenced you as a writer. What do you think was the one thing they had in common? Was there a theme or anything you were sort of drawn to as a child?
I just wanted to feel something. And I think this is what I'm like trying to do with my work too. I'm like, I wanted to, feel. I wanted to like be in that world and feel the
travel.
emotions and travel.
Travel through that
Yeah,
world.
so that's, I think, what still leads me in both my reading choices and how I write, you know.
You traveled extensively at around, I think before you did your compulsory military service.
No, after. It's between the age of 18 and 20, so there
Okay.
wasn't much time
And you
before.
went through Southeast Asia, Europe, North America.
Yeah.
Is that sort of the coming of age thing? That it's like Australians, they all go away
Yeah,
and
they
they
do that
travel the
too,
world.
yeah.
Is that a coming of age thing for an Israeli
Yes, but
person?
unlike Australian, I think it has a lot to do with the mandatory army thing. I feel like after you spend 2 years or 3 years for men in such a rigid, strict environment, you want to let loose. You want to travel the world and feel like you can do whatever you want. So traveling is, to me, I think it's very, very much tied with that.
It must be a very striking thing because to join an army, compulsory service, is such an authoritarian intrusion. I mean, the night before you went to start your service, what was going through your mind?
So that's the funny thing. You don't see it that way when you live in
Really?
Israel.
Yeah.
No, because this is it. This is your life. This is, you don't, it only occurred to me as odd after years of living here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like when people seemed really interested in it, when I traveled, and I was like,
What's the
can
big
we have
deal?
to talk about this again? It's super boring. Personally, I had a really hard time in the army. I don't do well with structure and like imposed structure. I'm
Yes.
good with setting my own structure. I'm very disciplined, but I'm not good with being imposed. And I'm not very good with authority, and I was way worse then. Like I did miserably in high school, so it was, I should have known I was doomed, but I didn't really.
Yeah.
And then it was just trouble after trouble. I got into a lot of trouble in the army.
What was your biggest fiasco?
Oh,
Are you
wow.
allowed to tell this story?
I can't because it's all in my memoir. Now I'm going to tell you
Okay.
everything, and you're not going to read it next year when it comes out.
There's a memoir coming out. There's some good army stories.
There's some good army stories in there.
Let's talk about the writer. At what age was the writer born? Was it a conscious decision, or did it sneak up on you?
I don't remember a time when I wasn't a writer. Before I could write, I used to draw comics and accompany just a narration. Be like, so that's the guy, and he's walking, and then he fell, and grab people and sit them down and listen to my stories. My sister is 7 years older than me, used to transcribe some of my stories when I was like 5. I would just she would just sit there and write what I was saying. So as soon as I knew how to write, I was writing. And as soon as I knew the alphabet, I was writing. So it kind of came built in. I feel like there was never a question. There was never a choice. It was just is.
Yes. Did you begin as a poet, largely as a poet?
No, I wouldn't say so. When I was a kid, I wrote everything, like everything, kind of like the way I was reading. So I tried poetry, and I even wrote like a script. I watched a TV show, and I was like, I wonder how you do that. And I tried that, I did everything, any type of writing. I think at some point I felt like poetry was just too hard, or my poetry was not good enough. I don't know, I just abandoned it in I would say maybe my early 20s and focused on fiction for a while.
So you mean you spent only about 15 years writing poetry?
Really bad poetry.
Isn't that a common thing with writers? So they all serve an apprenticeship early on in life, doing something else that's like writing but isn't quite,
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Now, coming from a place, living in a place where the political is such an impressing reality, is it difficult for you? I mean, I imagine like when people want the IDF stories, for example, they're viewing you through a specific geopolitical lens.
Sure.
Do you accept that lens? Do you accept that point of view when it comes to your work? Is that a convenient lens for you to be viewed through, or would you like to change that?
On one hand, like I have mixed feelings. On one hand, I resent having to being perceived necessarily as political in my writing,
Yes.
even if I, didn't intend on doing it. On one hand, on the other hand, I feel like where we're from and everything that makes us who we are is a big part of our writing. Not just thematically, but also in your style of writing. So I think it's all there. I think my Jewishness and Israeliness and Yemeniness, the whole thing is there in the way that I write. So I don't know if you can, it's a little bit of a departure from what you're saying, but I'm just saying I don't know if you can separate really.
You don't really have a choice, do you?
I don't think so. Yeah.
As in
you can
choosing.
try, but I actually tried. When I first started writing, I didn't want to. I thought it was too much of a responsibility to try and write about Israel because of what I mentioned. People are going to perceive it as political. People are going to get angry with me, and I wouldn't know why. I'm like, I don't want to do this, and I tried not to, and it was not really working. It wasn't really true, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've switched over to writing in English fairly recently. Would that be in the late 90s or so?
No, it was 2006.
Really?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting when one considers sort of the natural feel of the language in the collection? What are the differences between written, I suppose, did you write in Hebrew before?
Well, yeah, I've written in Hebrew my whole life. I published, I was a journalist, so I did that as well. And I published a little bit here and there, but I didn't have a book yet. I was young, and I actually didn't think that I was ready to publish a book. I moved here when I was 25. And at first, I imagined that I would write in Hebrew still, because I just couldn't imagine writing in English. That just seemed crazy. And then I just didn't write for a few years at all.
Mm-hmm. You had to make that transition. I guess the thing is imagine. You have to learn to imagine in English.
You have to imagine in English. You mean to think in English in a sense.
To dream in English, perhaps.
You can't translate. It has to go beyond translation. You can't just do the translation from Hebrew to English in your head.
Yes.
That's not, it might work, but it's not going to work very well, to my opinion. I always think translation is always second best. And I'm grateful for it because, it allows me to read all these wonderful books that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to read. But if I translate in my head, I sort of, the language, the level of the prose to me is a little bit, it's lessened. In a sense. So I needed to be able to create it originally in English. Mm-hmm. I hope, that makes sense.
You've mentioned in another interview that people refer to your writing as poetic and ask if you write poetry in English. Are you writing poetry in English?
Like you said, that was the one, the last frontier for me. I always thought, no, that's something I can't do. Even after I published a book in English, and I was like, okay, I guess I can kind of write in English. I still thought, no, poetry is something else. It's too deep. It's too tied with someone's, soul. I'm like, you can't do that in a second language. You just can't. Well, the sound thing is but prose has rhythm too. Yes. Prose has sound is important for that too. That's why if there's a word that I don't know and I want to use it, I'll always also research on the internet how it's pronounced. Yes. Because I'm like, that would make a difference in how the sentence is going to read, So, because I use words that I don't know sometimes, I have to because I keep learning all the time. So if it doesn't work, if it has a different sound than what my Hebrew mind was thinking, I won't use it. So I don't know. It was something else. It wasn't the sound for poetry. It was the essence of poetry that felt to me like would be too tied with...
the history of the word, perhaps. The etymology of the word.
That too, maybe. Yeah.
I'd like to talk about your debut short story collection, The Best Place on Earth. 11 pieces in this collection. How long did the entire book take you to compose? When was the first story started, and when was the last story finished?
So I wrote the first story before I started my program at Guelph, the MFA.
Yes.
And then over the 2 years that I was in the program, I wrote the other, I would say, 8 or 9, and then I wrote another one after or 2. So I would say maybe 2.5 to 3 years.
That's not bad.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Do you think that you're naturally a short story writer, or you're naturally a novelist, or you're naturally, it's sort of, writers are drawn in different directions?
I don't know. I really hope. I'm trying to write a novel, so I'd rather not answer this question.
Yeah.
I'd like to believe that I can.
Yeah. But you find the short story a format that you're comfortable with?
I've written short stories my whole life. I've written
Yes.
short stories as a teenager. I've always loved reading short stories. And there's something, I think, when you start out, even though people, it gets a bad rap and people are like, don't write short stories, they don't sell. There was something appealing to me about starting with short stories because it was easily manageable. I can work on one of them, work on one of them, maybe send them here and there, maybe one of them might get published. Well, when you do a novel, it's just like years of you like diving into this like black hole.
No sense of accomplishment.
Exactly. So to me, it made sense to sort of dip my water. And I also just, I love short fiction, so it made sense. And I think also for this book in particular, I was writing a book about transience and displacement and people who are moving from place to place. All the characters are nomadic, and it almost made sense to write it in short stories because it's like there's something about reading short stories that is very similar to the feeling of traveling.
Yes.
You get in and then you're like in there for a few days or whatever, as long as you do, and you get attached to people, you get attached to the place, and then you're off to the next. So there's something about the shape, the container here really fit with the content.
Now tell me, was it writing this collection, was it an educational process in the sense that earlier stories taught you how to write later stories? Were you building, you think, on the stories as you went?
I think writing is, everything you write, like you learn. So it's a process, and that's why you get better. So I guess so, yeah.
You have a variety of protagonists. It ranges from a 13-year-old boy to an elderly Yemeni woman. Was that a conscious decision to explore all those various perspectives?
I think in my life, I like to reinvent. I think there's a reinvention in migration. There's reinvention in starting to write in a new language.
Yes.
You can become a new writer. In my early days, I was into theater for a similar reason. There was something about being able to embody different characters that was really appealing to me.
Yes.
So I think writing for me is another way of being able to do that. And I love that. So I didn't, for example, with the first story in Tikkun,
Yes.
I chose the male perspective. I could have chosen to write it from Natalie's point of view if I wanted to, but I'm like, I actually naturally felt drawn to telling it from the men's point of view. Or in Brit Milah with the elderly Yemeni woman,
Yes.
It almost would have been too easy to tell the story from Ofra's point of view, the young daughter who lives in Toronto and raising a child and moved away from home. That would have been almost just not challenging and not rewarding in the same way as trying to embody an elderly woman, who's traditional in her thinking and in her belief system, someone that is not, I wouldn't necessarily relate to instinctively or intuitively.
Is there a specific person who is a model for her?
Not really. My mom is not quite her either. I mean, there's always my mom would be the obvious choice, but I took it further, I would say.
Yeah.
I made her more traditional than my mom.
Yeah. Do you think, we were talking earlier about being looked at through a geopolitical lens. I see in the collection ideas of the construct of identity, political identity, social identity. Where does one get one's identity? For example, the story, I think it's called Warplanes.
Yep.
The I character gains some of their identity through their absent father, the other children around them.
Yeah.
There's a sense of, and I ask myself, why is she so interested in identity? And the only thing I can come down to is history. One of the things that might strike you about Canada, first of all, Toronto, if you walk down the street, is that nothing's older than 50 years.
Right.
Whereas you've got in Israel, they've got a Wailing Wall that's 2,000 years old and they haven't replaced it yet.
Yeah.
So there's that intrusion of history. Do you feel that?
I do. Yeah, and again, it's hard for me to tell you if I felt it then or if I feel it now because I've been in other places. But yeah, I definitely think it's something that is a part of the ethos.
And absence creates longing?
Sure.
The story Warplanes, it's the only story that has an I?
No,
Is it?
there's two more.
Okay, I missed that.
Yeah, there's Tikkun is one of them, and Casualties is another.
Okay. Why an I in some, is that a technical challenge, going from third person to first person?
I don't know that I always know the answer for that. You know, like you start writing, a voice comes to you, you do what you do. Sometimes it doesn't work. You know, I think there was another story that was in first person, and I decided I didn't like it. There was something too whiny about it being in first person, and there's a risk in first person sometimes that it could, you know, sound too indulgent. So it's a kind of a fine balance. So I changed it to third. So usually I go. It's the same with tenses too. First, present or past. I would go for what calls to me, and then I examine if it works or not, and maybe the answer is changing the tense or changing the perspective. Maybe not, maybe it's something else, but that's just one. First of all, I just start with what comes to me.
There is a sense of continuity in the themes and the various plot arcs within each story.
Yeah.
So that there is a sense, in the way that one might have the sense with an Alice Munro collection, that there is perhaps a novel here that just has had pieces left out. But the last one, the last story is The Best Place on Earth, is set in BC.
Yeah.
And it seems to me to be the fitting conclusion to the collection in that it talks about getting beyond culture, beyond social identity or political identity. Is that something that's been striking you lately?
Well, the last story for me, first of all, it goes back, it takes place in BC, but there's a character there from Jerusalem, so it goes back to the first story that takes place in Jerusalem. And she reflects a lot on Jerusalem in that story. There's a lot of flashbacks in Jerusalem. But also the two sisters, to me, Tamar, who lives in a beautiful Gulf island, and Naomi, who lives in Jerusalem, they actually, they're kind of two facets of my identity. You know, I feel like, they both, that story is basically me in,
Did you figure that out while writing that story?
I can't tell you that
Write
now.
and learn? You're not sure?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how the story, like I said, sometimes you write the memory of something and then you don't know if the memory was like that or because you wrote it, that became the memory. So I can't tell you now if that's a realization that I made after I must have, because it feels too contrived to do it.
It's the right realization.
Yeah.
That's the thing about stories, is we try to make it, they make things convenient and explicable, and we all need that. Speaking of explicable and inexplicable, you started your stay in Canada. You moved to Vancouver in 1998.
Yeah.
Why Vancouver?
Because there was a guy.
A guy. Oh.
The old story, yeah.
Yeah. Now, you were a graduate of Simon Fraser's Writers Studio, and you also studied film and photography.
Yeah.
You had a couple of short documentaries
Yeah.
in a film festival, one of which I think placed second or something like that?
One of them won a film
Okay.
festival in Palm Springs, yeah.
What were the topics of the two documentaries?
Drugs. One of them was about medicinal marijuana in Vancouver. It was back when, it wasn't as well accepted, but there was a compassion club that one young woman created. So it was about her and her compassion club and some of the patients. And the second one was following a young man from a very affluent Vancouver family who became an addict in the downtown east side in Vancouver.
Right. Upstairs and downstairs, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did your explorations in film, did they influence you as a writer? Did they add a visual element?
So the reason why I went to film and photography, I came to Vancouver and suddenly the only thing I've ever known how to do was useless. It was like a non-transferable skill.
Yes.
My tools were gone. It was really, I always say for every immigrant coming to a new country, you kind of feel like your identity is suddenly under review in a sense.
Yes.
But then if your identity is so tied with words and you don't have the words, it's really, really painful and very disorienting. So I was looking for new ways to tell stories that didn't require words, and I've always loved photography. So I found this like a diploma program, a 2-year diploma program in Capilano College, and it was a way for me to just a way to tell stories.
And
basically.
a way to utilize your journalistic background, I suppose.
Yeah.
You went to Toronto. You did an MFA in creative writing here in Toronto. Was that at U of T?
No, so it was at the University of Guelph, but the
University of
campus
Guelph,
is here in Toronto somewhere, Etobicoke or somewhere, yeah.
How was that experience? You did the book while you were there. Did you workshop pieces?
Yeah, so it was a great experience overall. It was was a crazy transition for me because I actually don't have a BA.
Yes.
I've studied, I did the diploma, and then I studied, at the Writers Studio in Vancouver, which is just a part-time community kind of a program, which is a wonderful program. But I didn't have a BA. I never actually attended university. So when I got accepted to do the MFA, of course I was thrilled, but I was also very stressed about it. I was like, I'm not an academic, I'm ESL, all my insecurities suddenly,
Yes.
So the first term I was in deep anxiety, but then I slowly started to relax into it and realize it wasn't such an academic setting. It was mostly writing workshops, which was something I did feel fairly comfortable in. But probably the best part of it was working one-on-one with an established author.
Oh, with whom did you work?
Camilla Gibb.
Oh, Camilla Gibb, yes.
Yeah, and that I think would be the best thing about the program, is being able to work with an author.
What was her
as a mentor.
strength as a teacher?
She's very thorough. She's she's critical.
Yes.
Which I really appreciate. Very direct, very hands-on. Yeah. So we talked, like when I came, I also had, it was after a period of me trying to be more Canadian in my writing, which was disastrous. And I was really unhappy about fiction in general and basically wanted to quit it.
Yeah.
And she totally recognized it and said, why don't we try and read books that are not Canadian? And we created a reading list of a lot of writers of color, a lot of immigrant writers, a lot of transnational writers, just writers from everywhere in the world. And that really helped sort of give me hope and make me feel like, oh, there's so many ways in which you can write. There's no one way to do this. Made me feel like there's room. I imprisoned myself in this little thing, like, you have to do this, you only have to show and not to tell, and don't do any flashbacks, and all kind of rules that I lost myself in this, and I lost the joy.
And then you get into the messy mosaic that is Canada, and you say, forget about it. Let's just do what's fun, right?
Well, what's natural?
Yeah.
What's me?
Yeah.
You know, what's instead of trying to be something else, and naturally that would be more joyous, I think, joyful.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Tell me about Canada. First of all, does Canada still mean the same things it meant to you when you moved here in 1998? And contemporary Canada, what are we getting right? What do we need to work on?
I don't really know what it meant to me when I came here. I don't think it was just...
There?
It was what? What did you say?
It was just there?
It was there, yeah, and it was an escape, and it was another place to reinvent yourself. I didn't think I was going to stay.
Yeah.
You know, 20 years later, I'm still here. You know, but it wasn't. I feel like it's such a frivolous, you know, immigration story. I was an accidental immigrant who just sort of drifted rather than made a choice, a decision. And now, you know, I've been here for 20 years. And it's been so wonderful to me, and a lot of, you know, great things happened to me here. And yet, maybe because I moved when I was 25, I still am not entirely sure I can call myself Canadian. It's kind of like I find myself pausing a second before when asked.
Yeah, home
you know?
is where the childhood is, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
And where you come of age too, right? Because
Yeah.
for me it was, so I find myself always unsure still.
Tell me
know?
about this city of Toronto. What do you like about Toronto?
Oh,
Why
I love
have
Toronto.
you like?
I love Toronto.
What's that top three things? What do you like?
How diverse and multicultural it is.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me so happy. I didn't feel that in Vancouver.
Yes.
How, again, I'm keep comparing it to Vancouver because I love Vancouver too, but in a different way, right? The vibrancy, it's a really vibrant city. Vancouver tends to be a little calm and sleepy in a sense, but the calmness was good for me coming from Israel, such an intense place. You know, I think for the first few years in Canada, it suited me. And then I started to feel an itch for a little more vibrancy, and Toronto does that. And the literary scene is, again, just more happening, more diverse, more all of these things. So yeah, I love it. It just feels good to be here.
I would like to ask you my favorite question of the interview right now.
Okay.
My favorite question.
Oh my goodness, I'm scared.
You're a writer. You've written a lot of sentences.
Yeah.
What is a good sentence? How does it work by itself and in conjunction with other sentences?
Right. Yeah. What is a good sentence?
There will be a long pause here, during which time I will hum. When you finish a sentence, think of a sentence you've written that you really liked. Why did you like it?
It's one of those things. It's you know, we love to break down the act of writing to rules and things like that.
Yes.
And we have to accept that there's a level of mystery in the creative. I'm not trying to to romanticize it or to make it into like some mystifying thing. That's not what I mean. But there is some things that you can't really name. You know, it works when it works. Some sentences, you look at them and they're beautiful. Some sentences are not supposed to work because they're too long. One might say they're run-ons or they're fragments and they shouldn't work, you know, and they're still beautiful. So I feel like you just know, you know, when it's good. And it's true, it's all about the sentence, you know, like, but I don't know if I...
There's a synergy, isn't there?
But I can't say, yes, aliveness I call it sometimes too. But there is one thing which I sometimes talk about, which is that I love strong verbs.
Yes.
You know, precise language. Yeah.
And fairly visual and concise language. You're a
Imagery.
visual writer.
Sure, yeah.
But you're not Thomas Wolfe. You're more like Truman Capote.
Oh, yeah.
If that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
You're visual,
it does.
but you're very concise. And I
thank you.
suppose that's
Thank you.
your journalism coming out.
Maybe. And maybe it's just overwriting and then cutting like crazy.
Yeah. Let's talk about writing and cutting and stuff like that. Your working process. I know you can't explain it, but from the outside, what
Yeah.
does it look like? How many hours? What sort of routine? Is it time? Is it number of words? How does it work for you?
So it all changed with motherhood. So that's important to note. Before that, I would have like more of a, I write all day basically, really. Like,
How many hours?
eating in front of the computer. Depends. If there was a deadline coming or whatever, it could be all day, like literally all day.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would take breaks and go to the gym at lunch, come back. This is no longer the case. Once you have a child, it just changes the way you write. Now that she's in JK, I feel like I have a little bit more of a semblance of a discipline. But before, when she was a baby, it was like someone writes with like a gun to your head. I'm like, oh my God, she's sleeping.
I've got 2 hours.
Yeah, not even sometimes. I'm like, I can cook, I can shower, I can do laundry, or I can write. I got really good at like writing on the phone, and my friends like, stop texting while I'm pushing a stroller. I'm like, I'm not texting, I'm writing. You're like pushing a stroller, like. So that's why don't judge people on the subway and stuff when you see them. Maybe they're doing something really important.
They're all authors. They're all
Or they might be
unknown
reading.
writers.
I read on my phone too. But yeah, so it's hard to the discipline. There's still discipline. Sometimes I wake up at 5 if there's like deadlines, so I can get a couple hours before that 2 hours of getting her ready to school and taking her to school and all this. I don't like it, but sometimes I have to do this because it just doesn't feel like there's enough time in the day. And as far as I don't do the time, I don't do that. The time and the I just write. And what I try to do now is basically just go forward and not like I will stop and tinker, yes, a little bit, but not too much. Not to the point that I'm like polishing a sentence before I even finished writing it. I try to have a little bit of a forward motion when I'm writing. To move a
Controlled
little.
momentum.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more about mentors. Everybody has mentors. You've talked a bit about Camilla Gibb, but when you look back over your life, are there certain people you've learned things from that you may not have realized at the time, but now perhaps you're using it in life and art? Who are those people?
Well, I can think of 2, and I'll talk about my father in a minute.
Please.
But I want to mention author Wade Compton, who's a Vancouverite, and he was my first mentor at the Writer's Studio. And he, I think, taught me how to be a mentor, which is something I do now.
Yes.
I often wonder what would have happened if I had a different mentor for my first year, when I was so like insecure, writing ESL, writing and doing this crazy thing of writing in a second language. If I had someone else who was a little less supportive, a little more critical, I don't know. I don't know where I'd be today.
It's a reminiscent situation, isn't it, of your father's, and that he received that.
You're
but
right.
you got the right.
You're right. Yeah. I was. I'm really lucky. I'm really lucky for having Wade as a teacher. And as for my father, it's not just about the writing, because obviously he did give up on the writing, but I started that in the beginning, and then we kind of drifted into something else. He did enrolled in university to go back to studying literature and writing when he was in his 40s, but then he passed away, so he never got to do it. But he did, once he had 6 kids and they were a bit older. I mean, the young one was 2, but still he was like, okay, now is the time. He just never made it. But I wanted to say for him that one of the things that I learned from him, I think the most important thing that I learned from him was to be kind and to give back.
Yes.
And that's also something you can take into mentorship.
And it's also time for you to complete what he did, isn't it? In a way to carry on.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's look at who you look to learn from as authors. You're going into the library, you're going to a bookstore, and there are certain authors. It's not that their work particularly appeals to you in subject matter or whatever, but technically you learn from them. Who are those authors?
I love Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, Jhumpa Lahiri, Junot Diaz for his voice and his chutzpah, Yeah.
Who do you think of all the writers you studied, who is the one you think who has done the most interesting things, or the one you aspire to equal?
I don't know if I aspire to equal anyone. I want to just do my own thing.
Yeah.
But both my mentors, both Camilla and Wade, I admire them for different things. Wade is very innovative, very experimental in his writing, and he takes on issues of race and identity, and I admire what he does with that. Camilla is very technical. She's a masterful storyteller.
Yes.
So I learned a lot from her. Yeah.
What are the 3 things now you know as a writer that you wish you'd known when you started? The 3 things, these are the things that keep you going.
Oh, yeah. That you have a voice and you can't learn that.
Yes.
And you should just do your thing. That strong verbs are the pillar of strong prose. And that it's okay to tell. You don't have to show everything. There's beauty in telling. A lot of us come from traditions of storytelling, and there's something very oppressive about that need to just make it, cynic and cynic and cynic. I did that for a while, and then my stories were like, people are like, but what, we don't understand. But what are you trying to say?
Yes.
I'm like, oh, I guess there's a risk with only showing, that the reader might be confused. Yeah. That to me was a huge revelation, the day that I realized that you need a good balance of showing and telling rather than, show, don't tell.
So we have voice, verbs, telling.
Yeah.
That's what we're taking away from today's interview. Voice, verbs, and telling.
Yeah.
You're working on a memoir right now entitled The Art of Leaving. It's coming out in 2019. Why? Why is it
a really
necessary?
good question.
It's the only question I really know. Why is it necessary at this point?
I don't know. I
Is it
wondered
necessary?
that too. Why write a memoir?
Yeah, is it necessary that you do it? To you,
Well,
is it
obviously.
necessary?
Yeah.
But
Obviously, I'd only write what's necessary. You don't, it's not like, I feel like it's not about ideas at the end. I have a lot of great ideas, but what am I drawn to? What am I hunted by? What do I must write? That's basically what I end up writing.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing because I read the collection, The Best Place on Earth, and to me it has a very memoir sort of feel. And I think that the difference between Canada and Israel, most of Canada and most of Israel, is that in Israel, life has the resonance of narrative. You feel like you're part of this big story, this voice of a people telling a tale, in the same way as, I don't know, the Iliad or Red Badge of Courage or Beowulf, this war narrative. And in Canada, there's no way that memoir can be as interesting as fiction.
Maybe, I'm not sure.
And I apologize to those of you who have had an interesting life. Is that valid?
I like what you're saying. I agree about that larger narrative that sort of affects everyone. But I don't agree that there aren't great memoirs written in Canada. And I think I think everyone has a story. I really do. And I think it's about how you tell it, basically. It's about your writing and the choice you're making, which is always, all writing is choices, right? That we make choices of what to include and what to omit and how to write this and how to write that. Everyone has a valid story that can be made. I don't think that my life has been extraordinary,
But writing is a way of organizing it, I guess, putting it in order, and it's cheaper than an analyst.
Sure.
Theoretically.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
Theoretically, it's cheaper than an analyst.
Depends how long it takes you to write it.
What else is on your desk right now? What are you working on?
So I have started working on a novel, but it's too early to talk about it.
You don't want to talk about
no,
that.
it's too
That's
early.
a good move.
Yeah.
Ayelet Tsabari, you've been wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you
so much.
for dropping
Thank you.
by. Ayelet Tsabari. We have time for questions if anyone has questions. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. You look right there, please.
Hi.
Hi. I wanted to just ask you about writing, and especially perhaps in your younger days when you were in school and then after when you first got published. I feel as a writer, you end up reading reviews about your work, or let's say workshopping, you're getting feedback, and I think that can be difficult for writers
Sure.
who kind of put themselves out
Yeah.
there. So I wanted to ask how you kind of deal with that, either workshopping or when you read reviews.
That's one of the reasons when I mentioned that Wade was a good mentor for me at the time, because he wasn't very critical. I got the critical one later on, and it was a good time for me, at a time where I could take it. A time I was like, okay, you hate the story. It's not, it hurts, but I can take it, and I couldn't take it then, and maybe he knew that. So everything was a little softer. Later on, some of the issues I had in workshopping was people saying things like, people commenting on like what I said about those things that make you you. So that hurts, saying like, oh, it's too sentimental. I'm from Israel, like we're passionate. I don't know. Or like, I remember someone actually wrote by the side, it's only the first page and already it's too much. And that's, I feel like, I've been told I'm too much myself, when I came to Canada. So it's the personal, it feels personal, and that hurt. You do get better at it. You do know instinctively when criticism, you just know. It's like, this rings true. Maybe not on the first day. The first day you're like, ugh, they don't know anything. They're not my readers anyway, and that's okay. It's okay to feel that way. But then I find myself going and looking, and it either rings true or it doesn't. Sometimes also brainstorming it with a friend helps. Like I was like, I don't understand this feedback, and that was from my editor. That's a big deal, right? Like, and obviously she's not happy with something, but I don't know how to fix this, and I don't understand what she means. And right now I'm like, ugh, she doesn't know anything, So speaking with a friend, she's like, oh, you know what? It reminds me of the blah, blah, blah. And suddenly it all clicked. I'm like, oh, this is what's wrong. This is how I can fix this. And suddenly I was excited because I was going to make it better. But it is a process, and it does hurt, it does. As for reviews, I have to say, I just spoke to 2 different friends who don't read reviews. And I wonder if I can do that. I was wondering, I'm toying with the idea of trying that for the next book. Because they're like, we don't want that noise. Friends read them and they tell us, this is good, share it. So they would share it, but they actually haven't read it. And I'm fascinated by that. I keep thinking about it, and I'm like, maybe I should try it. But yeah, there's no easy cure. You know what I mean? But yeah, maybe give it a day or 2 of feeling shitty.
Thank you. We have a question right here and then over there. Please go ahead, sir.
Well, I was just going to mention, you asked her about her novel that wasn't published yet.
Yes.
I got a rule saying that talk about the book after it's published.
Yeah, that's why I'm not talking about it. Yeah.
She knows her crap, don't you, Ayelet?
Yeah.
Right back here, I think somewhere. Yes.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. 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 It's usually in the editing process, it's often in the beginning it is. Like one of the reasons why I can't wait to go back to the novel is because I'm sick of me. I'm sick of me, I don't ever want to write a memoir again. But yeah, it's a process again, and having friends, readers, is invaluable. And readers you can trust. That's the other thing, having a reader, at least one, that you really, really trust. And again, that friend, the same friend, would tell me, I'm like, isn't that a little bit like braggy, or isn't it a little bit self-indulgent? She will be like, yeah, what about if you take that adjective or take that word or just tone it down a tiny bit by saying that? And and sometimes even for me, like everything, I edit endlessly, obviously. So, yeah, it is more of a challenge for sure in memoir. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir, right here.
Yeah, I have a question about voice and style. You started writing when you were a child, and how did that voice and style develop briefly, and how long did it take?
Oh, wow. He was wondering about voice and style and when did it start developing, because I started writing as a child. I think as a child, you often emulate other writers. You try new things. I remember reading Enid Blyton and then doing a book about a group of kids that are solving and going on adventures together. Like almost everything that really moved me, I tried to do that. So I don't know if I had a distinct style back then. And as an adult, I think you have your voice, you just don't know it. And at first you're not very confident, so you keep maybe toning it down a little bit or going and then pulling back or editing it out. And there comes a point where you're just feeling more confident, allowing yourself to do, and that's when it comes through. So when people are talking about finding your voice, I feel like it's not really finding it, kind of unearthing it in a sense. And the other thing, I love this quote by Zadie Smith. She says, style is the writer's way of telling the truth. So that's why I'm saying, when I was trying to write in a different style, it felt like a lie. It was polished, and it was okay, and it looked fine, but it felt like a lie. It didn't feel good. And once I, allowed myself to do what came naturally to me, the style that came naturally to me, then that felt true and good. Yeah, of course. Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Thank you. Right back there, please.
Oh, yeah. So if you go on my website, under teaching, there's something called offerings. Offering.
Yeah, I don't know. Either is good.
Yeah, something like that. There, you'll see there's the guide, the writer's guide to publishing a literary magazine. There's a PDF that you can just download.
Okay. Are there any other questions? You've been great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ayelet Tsabari.
Thank you so much.
I just want you to let you know that the next interview will be on May the 15th, when I will be interviewing Antonio Nicasso. Antonio is an author who is an internationally recognized expert on organized crime, has written all sorts of books about organized crime internationally, and that will be on May the 15th, so please keep an eye out on the TPL listings. Thank you all. Good night.